When Dale Earnhardt Sr., the Intimidator, slammed into the wall on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, the world gasped. Decades of fearless racing, gutsy moves, and legendary wins ended in a heartbeat. But the story behind that fatal crash is darker and more chilling than most fans ever imagined. New details about the collision reveal the split-second chaos, the forces that no driver should endure, and the safety lessons Earnhardt's death forced onto NASCAR. What really happened in those final moments will leave you unsettled and show just how fragile even the greatest legends can be. So could this crash have been prevented? Join us as we pull back the curtains and uncover the shocking truth about Dale Earnhardt's final moments. Born to race, the early life of Dale Earnhardt. Dale Earnhardt wasn't just another NASCAR driver, he was the face of the sport. The fearless black number 3 roaring past rivals with a style so aggressive it earned him the name from fans, the Intimidator. He stacked up 76 Cup Series wins, 7 Winston Cup championships, and millions in career earnings. But numbers alone don't capture his legacy. Earnhardt was danger personified behind the wheel, a man who could make fans hold their breath with a single drive. And yet, for all his dominance on the car tracks, his story ended in a way no one expected. Slammed against a wall at Daytona and gone in seconds. But before tragedy, there was determination. Born Ralph Dale Earnhardt on April 29, 1951, in Kannapolis, North Carolina, he was raised in the shadow of his father, Ralph Earnhardt, a short-track legend who had carved his name into the dirt ovals of the South. Ralph was as tough as the tracks he drove, winning the NASCAR Sportsman Championship in 1956 and building a reputation for his raw determination. Dale grew up watching his father, not just admiring him, but itching to prove he had the same fire. That fire sparked early. At just 12 years old, Dale did the unthinkable. He secretly climbed into his father's car and joined a race. Against all odds, he nearly won, battling against one of his father's closest rivals. It was reckless, bold, and dangerously close to genius, the kind of move that would later define his career. By 1972, Dale was already racing his father head-to-head at Metrolina Speedway. It wasn't just a family pastime anymore. It was a battle for identity, respect, and legacy. The problem? Ralph never wanted his son to follow in his tire tracks. He knew firsthand how cruel the racing world could be, how it swallowed men whole. But Dale didn't care. School held no meaning for him, but acing did. So he dropped out and threw himself into the only dream he could see. Ralph trained him hard, harder than anyone else, and Dale often felt like nothing he did was ever good enough. Then, in 1973, tragedy struck. Ralph Earnhardt, the man Dale had spent his whole life trying to impress, collapsed from a heart attack at just 45 years old. Suddenly, the lessons were over. The mentor was gone, and Dale was left with an emptiness that would take decades to fill. From that point on, every race was more than just a competition. It was a silent conversation with his late father. Every trophy, every win, every near-death brush on the track. It was all Dale's way of saying, "See, Dad, I can do it too." By the time he claimed Rookie of the Year in 1979 and then a championship the very next season, fans were already witnessing history in the making. Dale was no longer just Ralph's boy. He was the future of NASCAR. Yet, the climb wasn't without scars. Dale carried the weight of his father's absence, the constant push to prove himself, and the pressure of being the sport's most intimidating figure. He became both loved and feared. The driver who'd shove you out of the way to win but flash that half grin that made fans adore him anyway. His story was always larger than racing. It was about survival, legacy, and a man who defied every limit until one limit stopped him for good. Because the story of Dale Earnhardt doesn't end with his championships or the roar of the crowd. It ends at Daytona in 2001, in a crash that still haunts the sport. And while fans thought they knew what happened that day, the truth that's been uncovered since is darker, more shocking, and more human than anyone ever imagined. Dale Earnhardt's marriages. Behind the wheel, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was untouchable, fearless, relentless, a man who stared danger down without blinking. But away from the track, his personal life told a different story, one marked by love, heartbreak, and second chances. Earnhardt wasn't just a legend. He was also a husband and a father, roles that carried their own twists and turns. It all started in 1968, when a 17-year-old Earnhardt married his high school sweetheart, Latane Brown. He was just a teenager with big dreams, but soon enough, life got serious. A year later, they welcomed their first son, Kerry. Yet, the young couple's relationship couldn't survive the weight of growing up too fast. By 1970, their marriage ended in divorce, leaving Earnhardt a father at just 19. But Dale didn't stay alone for long. In 1971, he walked down the aisle again, this time with Brenda G., the daughter of NASCAR car builder Robert G., a connection that kept racing running through the veins of the family. With Brenda, Earnhardt had two more children, Kelly in 1972 and Dale Earnhardt Jr. in 1974. For a moment, it seemed like Dale had found his footing, balancing family and his budding racing career. But the cracks showed quickly. Not long after Dale Jr.'s birth, the marriage fell apart, and once again, Earnhardt found himself starting over. Then came Teresa Houston. When the two married in 1982, it marked the beginning of what would be Earnhardt's longest and most enduring relationship. Teresa wasn't just a wife. She was a partner who understood the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world Dale lived in. 6 years later, in 1988, they welcomed their daughter, Taylor Nicole, completing the family picture. 3 marriages, 4 children, and a personal life that was just as fast and unpredictable as his time on the racetrack. Earnhardt may have been the intimidator on the track, but at home, he was simply a man chasing love, family, and a sense of balance that often seemed just out of reach. But while his heart searched for peace, his career was fueled by chaos and the kind of determination that turned ordinary men into legends. Racing wasn't just what Dale Earnhardt did, it was who he was. And if his home life was a series of sharp turns, then the racetrack was where he found his straightaway. Dale's NASCAR career. Dale Earnhardt's rise wasn't just about speed. It was about broken bones, bitter fallouts, and the kind of stubborn fire that wouldn't let him quit, even when everyone else thought he should. He made his Winston Cup debut in 1975 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, climbing into the number 8 Dodge Charger like a man with something to prove. He didn't win that day. He finished 22nd, barely ahead of a driver who'd later become his boss, Richard Childress. But the way he wrestled that car told the world one thing. This rookie wasn't just happy to be here. He was here to fight. By 1979, Earnhardt was turning heads. With Rod Osterlund racing behind him, he stormed onto the scene with 1 win, 4 poles, and enough top finishes to grab Rookie of the Year honors. But here's where things get crazy. Just 1 year later, he pulled off the impossible. With 5 wins and relentless consistency, he clinched his very first Winston Cup championship, becoming the only driver in NASCAR history to go from Rookie of the Year to Cup champion in back-to-back seasons. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance, it was raw, fearless talent. But success never came smoothly for Earnhardt. By 1981, his team owner sold the operation mid-season, and suddenly the reigning champion was out of a ride. Earnhardt, never one to bow down, jumped ship to Richard Childress Racing, but later walked away, citing bad chemistry. For most drivers, that kind of shakeup would have stalled momentum. For Earnhardt, it was just another turn in the road. At Childress's suggestion, he signed on with Bud Moore in 1982. Driving the number 15 Wrangler Ford Thunderbird, he found himself battered more than blessed. Mechanical failures, wrecks, even a broken kneecap after a brutal crash at Pocono. It felt like fate was testing just how much punishment he could take. But Dale was Dale, and he clawed his way back, even nabbing a win at Darlington and proving the fire still burnt. By 1984, fate had swung back his way. He returned to Richard Childress Racing, this time in the now iconic number 3, and everything clicked. Wins came at Talladega, Atlanta, Bristol, and Martinsville, laying the foundation for one of the most legendary runs NASCAR had ever seen. Then came 1986 and 1987, back-to-back championships that cemented his reputation. 11 wins in 87 alone. Fans watched in awe as he bullied his way around tracks, pulling off wild moves like the famous pass in the grass during the Winston All-Star race. He didn't actually pass anyone in that moment, but the sheer audacity of keeping his car under control, flying across the infield grass without losing the lead, was enough to brand him with a name that stuck forever: the Intimidator. He wasn't just racing, he was waging psychological warfare, staring down rivals in the rearview until they broke under pressure. Fans loved him, drivers feared him, NASCAR fined him. He didn't care. Dale Earnhardt only knew one gear: forward. By 1988, his car was no longer the blue and yellow Wrangler ride fans had grown used to. Instead, the number 3 emerged in sinister black, backed by GM Goodwrench. That paint scheme wasn't just branding, it was a warning. From then on, the black number 3 wasn't just a car, it was a statement. I'm coming, and you better move. But even legends stumble. In 1989, a late race spin cost him the championship, letting Rusty Wallace edge him out by just 12 points. For a man like Earnhardt, that kind of miss didn't sting, it festered. And in 1990, he came back swinging with 9 wins and another championship. He was unstoppable, and the number 3 shop even hung the blown tire that cost him the Daytona 500 that year on the wall as a reminder. Close doesn't cut it. The titles kept rolling. By 1991, he was a 5-time champ. In 1993, after a season of dominance, claimed his 6th. Then, in 1994, he did the unthinkable. He tied Richard Petty's record with a 7th championship. The man who had once driven his father's car in secret as a 12-year-old kid was now sitting shoulder to shoulder with the king. But the truth about Dale is that he didn't just collect trophies. He built moments fans never forgot. His first road course win at Sears Point, his victory at the Brickyard 400 in Indianapolis, which he called the biggest of his career. Even his failures were epic, like the Daytona 500 heartbreaks that always seemed to slip from his grasp in the cruelest of ways. And through it all, Earnhardt never softened. He didn't race to make friends. He didn't race to play it safe. He raced to win, no matter who was in his way. That stubborn, hard-edged drive brought him glory. It also set the stage for tragedy, but that part of the story comes later. The first accident that almost ended Dale's career and his life. By 1996, Dale Earnhardt wasn't just racing for wins, he was chasing history. The Daytona 500 once again slipped through his fingers, with Dale Jarrett stealing the glory for the second time, but Earnhardt fired back fast. Rockingham, Atlanta, back-to-back victories that reminded everyone the black number 3 still had teeth. Then came Talladega, July 28th, the die-hard 500. Earnhardt was sitting second in points, gunning for an 8th championship when disaster struck. Ernie Irvan lost control, clipped Sterling Marlin, and chaos happened. Earnhardt's Chevrolet rocketed into the tri-oval wall at nearly 200 miles per hour. The impact was bone-jarring. His car flipped, skidded across the track, and was slammed in the roof and windscreen by oncoming traffic. For a moment, the silence was chilling. Fans watching thought they had just witnessed the end of Dale Earnhardt. When safety crews rushed to the wreck, the picture looked grim. But then, the impossible happened. He crawled out of the mangled number 3, waved defiantly to the crowd, and flat-out refused the stretcher. The man had a broken collarbone, a fractured sternum, and a busted shoulder blade, but he stood tall like nothing could break him. It was the kind of moment that proved just how tough he was. Doctors begged him to rest. Earnhardt, he was back in the car the very next week. He started at Indianapolis, but the pain was too much. He pulled out after the first pit stop, handing the wheel to Mike Skinner. For Dale, that wasn't just a tough call, "It was torture. Hardest thing I've ever done," he admitted. But 1 week later, bruised, battered, and stitched together, he roared back at Watkins Glen, grabbing pole position in a storybook moment fans dubbed the True Grit pole. Shirts popped up in the stands with his steely face and the words, "It hurt so good." And it did. Dale led most of that race, fighting like a man possessed, before fatigue finally forced him to settle for 6th. He wouldn't win again that year, but he still finished 4th in points, proving toughness wasn't measured in trophies. It was measured in scars. 1997 brought more punishment. He went winless, save for another Speed Weeks triumph in the Twin 125. But his season unraveled in terrifying fashion when a crash at Darlington left him disoriented, driving with double vision, unsure where his pit box even was. Fans spoke about retirement. Doctors couldn't explain what had happened. But somehow, Earnhardt clawed his way to 5th in the standings, bruised, broken, unstoppable. Then came 1998, the year fate finally caved. After 19 years of heartbreak, Dale Earnhardt won the Daytona 500. The moment was pure magic. Every pit crew member from every team lined pit road to shake his hand as he rolled into victory lane. Then, in one of the most iconic celebrations in NASCAR history, he spun the number 3 through the infield grass, carving the number 3 into the Daytona turf like a signature for the ages. He raised his arms, looked at the fans, and declared, "We won it! We won it! We won it!" For a man who had chased that race for 2 decades, it was redemption in its purest form. But racing has a cruel way of balancing triumph with torment. That 500 would be his only win of the season. Bad pit stops, blown chances, and mid-season shakeups left him 8th in points. Still, nobody cared. The Daytona 500 was his crown jewel, and nothing could tarnish it. By 1999, the talks grew louder. Earnhardt was 48. His son, Dale Jr., was climbing the ranks. Retirement rumors swirled. But Dale wasn't done writing his story. That year, he swept both races at Talladega, flexing the restrictor plate that had become his signature. Then came Bristol. With worn-out tires, he clashed with Terry Labonte in the final laps. The bump, the spin, the boos, the quote that would echo forever. "I didn't mean to turn him around. I just wanted to rattle his cage." Vintage Earnhardt, ruthless, unapologetic, and unforgettable. The year 2000 brought something more: rebirth. Neck surgery had finally fixed the nagging pain from that brutal '96 Talladega crash. And suddenly, the Intimidator looked dangerous again. At Atlanta, he edged Bobby Labonte by 0.010 seconds in a photo finish that had fans on their feet. At Talladega, he stormed from 17th to 1st in the final 4 laps. A comeback so wild it became NASCAR folklore. The no-bull $1 million bonus was his, along with his 10th Talladega victory. For a man nearing 50, he looked ageless, fearless, and hungrier than ever. By season's end, he'd stacked up 2 wins, 13 top 5s, and an average finish good enough to put him 2nd in the standings. An 8th championship slipped through his grasp, but everyone watching knew Earnhardt was far from finished. The new details: Dale Earnhardt's crash. Part 5. On the afternoon of February 18, 2001, the unthinkable happened. The man they called the Intimidator slammed headfirst into the wall on the final lap of the Daytona 500. Dale Earnhardt wasn't just another racer out there chasing glory. He was blocking, protecting, and playing defense so his son, Dale Jr., and his teammate, Michael Waltrip, could battle for the win. But in a blink, that final act of selflessness turned into tragedy. The collision was brutal. A brush with Sterling Marlin sent Earnhardt's black number 3 Chevrolet sliding, and when he fought to correct it, his car clipped Ken Schrader's and shot straight into the concrete retaining wall at nearly 160 miles per hour. The impact wasn't survivable. In that instant, Earnhardt suffered a basilar skull fracture, a fatal injury that killed him instantly, even before rescue crews could reach the wreck. At 5:16 p.m., Doctors at Halifax Medical Center pronounced the legend dead. He was 49 years old. And just like that, the sport's fiercest warrior was gone. But here's where the story turns chilling. Dale Earnhardt's crash wasn't just another freak accident. He was the fourth driver in only 8 months to die from the same exact type of injury. Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., and Tony Roper had all suffered basilar skull fractures in crashes leading up to Daytona. NASCAR had been warned, but change came too late. Millions watched live as the wreck unfolded. Michael Waltrip, Earnhardt's driver, crossed the finish line to score the biggest victory of his life, with Dale Jr. finishing right behind him. But behind them, in Turn 4, NASCAR's greatest star lay motionless. Cameras panned quickly away. Schroeder, who had walked over to Dale's mangled car, later admitted what he saw. I knew he was dead. He waved frantically for medics, but deep down, he already understood. When NASCAR President Mike Helton finally stepped before reporters less than 2 hours later, his words broke the sport in half. This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements I've ever had to make. We've lost Dale Earnhardt. The aftermath was seismic. Fans mourned, drivers were shaken, and NASCAR could no longer look away from the truth. For years, Earnhardt had railed against restrictor plate racing at superspeedways like Daytona, warning that the pack-style racing it created was dangerous. Just months earlier, after a rough, crash-filled race, he told Richard Childress, his car owner and longtime friend, "If they don't do something to these cars, it's going to end up killing somebody." Those words became a haunting prophecy. But Earnhardt's death forced NASCAR to finally act. Within months, the sport mandated the Hans device, a head and neck restraint many drivers had resisted. Safer barriers were installed at high-speed ovals, seats and belts were redesigned, and eventually, the sport rolled out the car of tomorrow, built with survival in mind. Since Earnhardt's death, not a single driver has been killed in NASCAR's top 3 divisions. The man who lived by pushing the limits ultimately became the reason those limits were rewritten. The official investigation was chilling in its detail. Earnhardt's car hit the wall at an angle between 55 and 59 degrees, at a speed of roughly 161 miles per hour. The impact lasted just 80 milliseconds, but carried the force of dropping from nearly 62 feet in the air. It was violence beyond what the human body could endure. That small mistake, that tiny window of bad luck, carried the weight of finality. Dale Earnhardt's funeral 4 days later in Charlotte drew thousands. Teammates, rivals, celebrities, and fans all gathered to say goodbye to the man who had defined an era. His black number 3 would never race again in NASCAR's Cup Series. Earnhardt wasn't invincible, and that's what shook the world. For decades, fans had believed the Intimidator was untouchable. A man who could stare down death at 200 miles per hour and walk away with a smirk. But on that February afternoon in Daytona, reality crashed harder than any car ever could. His death wasn't just the end of a career. It was the beginning of a new NASCAR, a safer NASCAR. And in a way, Dale's greatest victory came not in one of his 76 wins or 7 championships, but in the lives of every driver who climbed out of a wreck after 2001 and walked away. The aftermath of Dale's death. Earnhardt's death didn't just shake NASCAR. It froze an entire nation in disbelief. Headlines screamed. One newspaper branded it Black Sunday, and fans across the country sat stunned. His funeral came quickly, just 4 days later, on February 22, 2001, at Calvary Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thousands poured in, while millions grieved from afar. But grief has a nasty way of turning into anger, and for many fans, that anger had a target: Sterling Marlin. Hate mail and even death threats flooded his home, as people blamed him for the crash. It got so bad that Marlin was forced to stand before the world and defend himself. His words were raw, his voice heavy. "I definitely didn't do anything intentional. We were just racing our guts out for the last lap of the Daytona 500. Everybody was going for it. Dale's car got caught in the middle, 3 wide with Ken Schroeder. I was as low as I could go. I watched the tape one time, and that is all I want to see of it. Even Dale Earnhardt Jr. had to step in. He publicly cleared Marlin of blame and begged fans to stop pointing fingers. But the storm didn't stop there. Bill Simpson, the man whose company manufactured the seatbelt Earnhardt wore that day, also became a target. He received his own death threats, proof of just how raw emotions ran. Darrell Waltrip, himself a veteran of the sport, tried to explain it. NASCAR is an emotional sport. When something like this happens, the connection makes you want to blame somebody. The comparison was inevitable. Just as Formula One had been shaken by the death of Ayrton Senna in 1994, NASCAR now had its own tragedy. Years later, Brad Keselowski recalled how Earnhardt's death mirrored that moment in his own home. He remembered being just a kid, watching his father, normally stoic, fall into silence after Senna's crash. When Earnhardt died, that same somber weight returned. But as time passed, grief turned into tribute. On the 20th anniversary of the crash, during the 2021 Daytona 500, fans rose to their feet on lap 3. They held up 3 fingers, the number that had become larger than life. That same number would never be casually used again. Richard Childress, Earnhardt's longtime team owner, swore that no black Goodwrench car would ever run the number 3 again. Instead, the team moved forward as number 29. The paint changed, the stripes shifted. But a small number 3 decal always rode alongside. For over a decade, that little number sat quietly on the car, a reminder of who had built the legacy they were carrying. And then, in 2013, Childress brought the number back, not for just anyone, but for his grandson, Austin Dillon. The number 3 had returned, but it wasn't just a number anymore. It was a symbol of a man, of a tragedy, and of a sport forever changed. The cause of death controversy. 5 days after Dale Earnhardt's death, NASCAR finally broke its silence. At a tense press conference, officials dropped a bombshell. The left lap belt on his seat harness had snapped. According to NASCAR's medical expert, Dr. Steve Bohannon, that failure allowed Earnhardt's chin to slam against the steering wheel, snapping his neck and causing the fatal basilar skull fracture. The implication was heavy. Maybe, just maybe, Dale would still be alive if that belt had held. But not everyone bought it. The very first paramedics at the scene swore the belts weren't broken when they cut Earnhardt free. Loose, yes, but not broken. NASCAR's own follow-up painted a different picture. Investigators claimed the buckle on Dale's harness sat several inches off-center, something they argued was impossible unless the belt had torn. Fans and experts were left in a fog of confusion. Did the seatbelt really fail, or was NASCAR using it as a scapegoat? Bill Simpson, the man whose company made the belts, suddenly found himself in the crosshairs. He was already fielding death threats, and now people were saying that his equipment killed a legend. Simpson fired back, saying the belts had been installed the wrong way, adjusted for Dale's comfort instead of safety. The finger-pointing spiraled until Teresa Earnhardt, Dale's widow, stepped in. She took the extraordinary step of petitioning a judge to block public release of her husband's autopsy photos, a move that split opinion but ultimately shielded her family's grief. Instead, Duke University's Dr. Barry Myers was brought in to deliver the truth. His findings flipped the narrative on its head. Earnhardt's death wasn't caused by a broken belt at all. The real killer was the violent whiplash of his unrestrained head and neck snapping forward, something no seatbelt alone could have prevented. In fact, experts like Dr. Steve Olvey and crash scientist John Melvin backed Myers up. Bill Simpson, worn raw by weeks of accusations, called it the best news I've heard in 7 weeks. I've been living in daily hell. NASCAR eventually released its own $1 million investigation. Their verdict? Dale's death was the result of a cruel cocktail of factors. The violent angle of impact, the secondary collision with Ken Schraeder, and yes, the belt separation. But one fact became impossible to ignore. If Earnhardt had been wearing a head and neck restraint, like the Hans device, he might have stood a fighting chance. NASCAR wouldn't mandate it immediately, but the pressure was building. By October of that same year, the sport's hesitation shattered. During an ARCA race in Charlotte, driver Blaise Alexander was killed in a last-lap crash, ironically while battling Earnhardt's oldest son, Kerry, for the lead. That was the breaking point. Just weeks later, NASCAR mandated the use of the Hans or Hutchins device across its top series. By 2005, only the Hans survived. Safety changes began to snowball. 6-point harnesses replaced the old 5-point belts. Tracks started installing safer barriers. NASCAR even designed an entirely new machine, the Car of Tomorrow, built with crash research that traced back to the Earnhardt investigation. That car's DNA carried forward into the Gen 6 design, the very innovations credited with saving Ryan Newman's life in his own terrifying Daytona 500 wreck in 2020. The sport had been forced to change. Dale's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the catalyst that redefined safety in NASCAR. The Autopsy Pictures controversy. On February 19, 2001, Dale Earnhardt's body was examined by the Volusia County Medical Examiner. What stood out wasn't just the autopsy itself, but the unusual move to notify both NASCAR and Teresa Earnhardt before the public release of any records. That decision raised eyebrows, because under Florida law, autopsy files, photos included, were typically considered public record. But just 3 days later, Teresa Earnhardt pushed back hard. On February the 22nd, she filed a legal brief in the Circuit Court of the 7th Judicial Circuit of Florida, Case Num 2000-130373 CIAC, Division 32, setting off a storm that quickly turned into one of the most bitter legal fights in NASCAR history. By the end of that same month, multiple media outlets stepped in to challenge her. On February the 28th, the Orlando Sentinel filed a motion, soon followed by Michael Uribe, the founder of WebsiteCity.com, and Campus Communications, Inc., the publisher of the University of Florida's independent Florida Alligator. Their goal was simple but explosive. They wanted the right to inspect and copy every piece of the Earnhardt autopsy file, including the photographs and videotape of the legendary driver's examination. That battle finally reached the courtroom from June 12th to June 13th, 2001. Judge Joseph Will presided over the tense trial, where arguments of privacy, transparency, and constitutional rights clashed. When the ruling came down, it was in Teresa Earnhardt's favor. Judge Will denied Uribe and CCI's requests, shutting down their constitutional arguments and barring the release of the autopsy photographs. But the fight didn't stop there. Uribe and CCI escalated the battle to appellate courts, arguing that the denial violated both Florida state and federal laws. Their appeals dragged on for years, but the momentum shifted again on December 1st, 2003, when the United States Supreme Court refused to hear their case. The rejection effectively ended the legal war, securing Teresa Earnhardt's victory and keeping the autopsy photos sealed forever. The fallout didn't just stay in NASCAR. The controversy left a shadow over how celebrity deaths were handled in the digital age. Just a year later, in April 2002, another tragedy struck. TLC singer Lisa "Left Eye" Lopes was killed in a car accident in Honduras. Within days, graphic autopsy photos of Lopes began circulating online, fueling outrage and reopening the same ethical questions raised by Earnhardt's case. Should the public's right to know ever outweigh the dignity and privacy of the dead? In the end, Dale Earnhardt's death didn't just change racing. It changed the conversation around privacy, media ethics, and the thin line between public curiosity and human respect. His crash redefined safety in NASCAR, and his widow's courtroom fight redefined how far families could go to protect a loved one's legacy. Even in death, the Intimidator kept pushing boundaries, forcing the world to confront hard truths it couldn't ignore. What do you think about Dale Earnhardt? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.